All right, so let's get our last conversation on the program on the road this morning. There seems to be this very, if you like, strong correlation between data and the economy. As a matter of fact, it will appear the economy cannot move from one point to another unless, of course, you have data to drive it in terms of planning and, of course, projection. However, gross domestic product, GDP as we often call it, is one that creates a bit more haziness for citizens than it helps them to understand how that economy is probably moving from point A to point B. Therefore, at this point where the conversation about rebasing the GDP is becoming a bit more, if you like, rife by the day, it's only natural that viewers want to understand exactly what the dynamics are and how they influence the pattern of the economy from the standpoint of the GDP. This morning, I'm joined by someone to help us find some sense and perspective in this regard. Abiodun Adeniyi is a professor of communication at Bayes University here in Abuja. Prof, thank you very much for coming through.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Let's talk about, first of all, GDP. What exactly is it in real terms beyond, well, textbook economics, as they call it? And then what are the elements around it in relation to the economy?
Okay, I think in regular understanding, the GDP is gross domestic product,
Right.
which is an aggregate of the total body of activities in terms of goods, sales of goods, services that transpires in the country, over a particular period of time, usually 5 years, advisably. But sometimes we get measurement, going beyond 5 years, usual situations. But actually, it should be every 5 years, going by global, going by recommendations by global bodies. And of course, it helps an economy to understand the state of its well-being,
Right.
to be able to know where weaknesses are and appropriately make projections, into the next round of GDP and rebasing, as the case could be. It's very important to understand it because it helps in different areas. It helps for planning. It helps for the gauging of where else a government or a country needs to invest its effort, towards development. So GDP might just be concerned about growth, but the development element is also very important.
That's right.
But if you do not understand it, and then of course you cannot be focused on development. So by the time you understand your GDP, your growth may be appreciable, and of course you can begin to make projections for development. But if growth is not appreciable, then you know where the limitations are, and you build towards the next level.
Interesting. And then, I mean, one of the, if you like, indices by which countries are measured economically is the size of their GDP.
Yeah.
And then you're wondering, is there a nexus between GDP and economic development? And to what extent is that? For example, if we say the GDP of Nigeria is XYZ, is that clearly or definitively indicative of how well the economy is?
Not necessarily. Again, it might also be
An indicator.
it might be an indicator, but not necessarily, because if you see most countries with huge GDPs, they're also very developed. And sometimes you see there are some countries with low GDP being able to be classed as developed in terms of the provision of the basic necessities of life that people in developing countries are also exposed to. But what we always want to imagine, if there's growth, true of GDP, is just a symbol of increased activities in that entity over a period of time. Increases of activities, trade, commerce, investment, production, huge transactions, in service at the service level as well.
Right.
Then of course, if there's this boom, you can expect that it will trigger the multipliers on the back of the opportunity to provide jobs, stimulate, trade, stimulate all sorts of economic activities. So you can just, at the level of imagination, you can picture this and say, okay, your economy is doing well at the level of growth as indicated in your GDP. But it doesn't translate into development because development necessarily involve a couple of other things.
Right.
It's about how well wealth is distributed, how well services are provided, how well they are initiated, and sustained on a continuous level, without necessarily trying to repeat it. So if there's a continuation, a systematic ordering of these opportunities, of these provisions, these utilities and facilities to the people, and the system becomes a little more predictable,
right,
then you can say growth is equating to development. But they can work together. GDP is not an end in itself,
right,
necessarily, but can be a means to an end. Because if there's growth, it can propel development. But you can hardly have, sometimes you can also have development without adding up to growth, but it is rare.
Okay.
But you want the two to go together.
To go side by side.
Yeah, to go side by side. Yeah.
Let's talk about approaches for computing GDP. For example, you highlighted a few of them. You talked about manufacturing, talked about the service level, the factor, I mean, the real sector and what have you. But what are basically the approaches for calculating?
I think in Nigeria, for instance, or in the average, in the usual country, it is the National Bureau of Statistics that is responsible for it. And they've got their networks across the country. They've got their partners, global partners, national partners as well. They have the expertise, the technocrats. They are, and of course, they have. I think they do some comprehensive survey,
right,
and they have their mechanisms worked out. Their methodology is clearly worked out. They do comprehensive surveys over the years, over some years that are marked out, and they benchmark it, or they begin from a particular number of a particular year, as the baseline year. Then from then on, they make their projection. So it can be a very painstaking and expensive process.
That's right.
I'm sure that's probably the reason why we have gone beyond 5 years before we are stepping on to the next one. And of course it can be affected by a couple of other things. If a country is at war, for instance, you cannot expect it to be calculating its GDP. If a country is in some other kinds of political turmoil, maybe conflict, maybe absolute completely deceased.
Maybe natural disasters.
That natural disaster, you cannot expect it to be computing it GDP. But when there's relative stability, then there's no reason why they should embark on it, considering the role that it plays in the determination of a country's economy and, of course, in its progress.
Now the conversation really, front and center is about rebasing or re-benchmarking.
Yeah.
The GDP. Talk to us about the necessity of that and what the implications are.
Well, it's very necessary, especially now that we are where we are. We have grown far beyond what we were in the last 10 years. And of course, our economy has also progressed. There has been some level of diversification. This is an economy that before now, we couldn't be talking about creative economy. It's injected into it's now very obvious that it needs to be added. Before now, you can't be talking about pension funds. Now it needs to be added. What about entertainment, And what about information technology, fintech, and all such innovations, These are new entries into the sector.
Right. And
you agree with me that they are booming and adding a lot to the economy, You can see how we are witnessing the multiplication. We can see how the fintech is creating some kind of domino effect on economic activities. How a lot more people are being brought into the informal sector, which is the dominant sector in the country anyway. But we are seeing that sector expanding. We cannot ignore these things against the background of our witness to how other African countries have been doing their own.
Yeah.
At the time in Africa we were the largest, but I think we're behind South Africa now, Morocco, and maybe Egypt as well.
Right.
But maybe if I'm not going to be surprised if after the figures are out, we are shot up a little bit, if not necessarily the first, but not too far from the first.
As it stands right now, given all you've said in the last couple of minutes, it just shows that this process is not only cumbersome and rigorous, it's also expensive. But let's talk about the benefits that accrue to Nigeria on account of rebasing or re-benchmarking the GDP, whether at the policy level or on other fronts.
No, it has so many benefits. First, there are concerns now about our debt burden. Right. Nobody is saying that government should continue to borrow unnecessarily, but maybe by the time we do the rebasing, we'll see the figures. We probably may not have any reason to be alarmed at how much we're owing. Because if our GDP can accommodate it, yeah, why not? And as long as the debts are being used for good reasons, for good purposes, you know. We are seeing activities going on at the state level, at the federal level, and of course, again, you know how GDP can be useful for helping foreign investors to determine the possibility of investing in our economy. Where the market could be there, but if there are no assurances that that market can accommodate a kind of investment, no investor, no capitalist will want to bring his or her investment into that environment. But the GDP figure, we know, will signal that an appropriate decisions can be made, not necessarily one around conjectures, speculations which are not necessarily certain.
Apparently, the rebasing and re-benchmarking is a cycle. But then how often should it be done, especially given the peculiarities associated with Nigeria as a country?
The global best practice is actually 5 years, you know, but sometimes there could be, we may go beyond it, just like now, which is where...
So as it stands right now, we've gone beyond 5 years.
Oh yeah, it's about 10 years now. You know, it's about 10 years now, and of course, we know that we are late, but it's not to say that we cannot get back to it, get back on track, like we're presently trying to do, or like we heard that government is trying to do. And I think MBS, we have seen signals from MBS that they are ready. We have read it in the media a couple of times in the last few days. They're warming up, you know, to release it. And it will also be helpful. Don't forget again that most of MBS figures, like CPI, for instance, often instruct central bank fixing of MPR and such other things. And GDP is also not far from it, you know, because there's a way these things can work together to give us a complete picture of what our well-being looks like.
The United Nations Statistical Commission has its recommendation in this regard in terms of what the cycle should be for rebasing. So what are the factors that have made it near impossible for us to have done that before now?
I think, do not forget that within the last 10 years, we had the onslaught of COVID-19 pandemic. That was somewhat instructive. And we've gone through some very traumatic electioneering process. You know, it may not necessarily be directly impactful, but you cannot ignore these elements as well.
That's right.
Then, of course, what about the costs? You know, the direct costs of processing it. You know, through expenditure on on field work, as the case could be. We may think this is routinious, but it can also be very laborious and cumbersome, considering the size of Nigeria, considering the workforce that you need, and considering that you are not going to be deciding these things alone. You also need the input of experts, you know, and people who have done it elsewhere, and people who can advise you appropriately. These things don't come cheap, you know. All those factors will probably have been reasons, you know, why we haven't been able to do it until now.
Let's talk about some of the variables that have led to the choice of this particular base year. For instance, is it because there are developments that have now made that a matter of sheer necessity?
I think, you know, I was talking about COVID earlier, and the
right.
fact that we last did it almost about 10 years ago.
And that's a long time.
Sometimes, what I understand, the way I understand it works is that sometimes they want to look at a year where there's relative stability, you know, a year where there's a good ground for you to begin from. You know, there might be other reasons, but I think they concentrate more on the year that is most feasible. And do not forget how research works. You know, research is essentially begins at the level of judgment. So you make your own judgment, trying as much as possible and not to introduce subjective notioning into it, whether at the academic or at the governance level. So what they would have thought is that maybe not alone, in consultation with experts, foreign and local, is to think about a particular year and look at all the variables, dependent and independent, and just think that this is the year that is most appropriate.
Quite interesting. I'm sure there's that one person watching now and is asking, hold on a second, we understand data and GDP are more like Siamese twin, for example. Incidentally, maybe unfortunately so, we live in a country where there's always, for want of better words, question marks. You always have question marks over data. It will appear the authenticity or otherwise of data is always an issue of debate in this country. So how do we trust these data?
Well, you cannot be too shocked about that. I'm not shocked because I know that in this part of the world, and maybe for good reasons, we are very suspicious of government efforts. What they tell us most of the time, we just put question mark to it because maybe past disappointments, past letdowns. But it's not going to be a reason why we should not keep trying. And data can actually be empirical. It can be scientific. We might say they have been manipulated, but let's just look at it in the primitive sense, in a primitive way. So if you don't want the data, or if you don't have the data, what do you rather work with? Are you going to just making conjectures, or you just be dreaming? You wake up, your vision. Today I predict that Nigerian GDP is one. Is that what you want to do?
On the basis of emotion.
On the basis of emotion. So you still have to work with data. You still have to invest a little bit of trust in those who are in charge of it. Otherwise, you just be working, without any navigator, into working without a navigator in an area where you're not familiar with. So we need some guide, really.
We do.
And I want to also believe that there are ways in which you can critically check these things, whether they are true or not. It's not enough for you to just be critical of MBS figures. You just see the figures and say, I know what you're looking at. But have you looked at the methodology?
Right.
Have you looked at the research design? Okay. Have you looked at the concepts in the first instance? Look at what led to the final figure. Examine them all together from a holistic point of view and not from a singular unilinear dimension. If we want to be fair to the figures, because I want to believe that they always do a good job because they've got the experts. It's not a new body. They've been there over the years. They are not political. They are not. It's not a religious organization. It's not an ethnic organization. It's a national organization, and of course they've got partnerships, collaborations, with foreign bodies, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations Development Program, and such other multilateral organizations. So they don't work alone, irrespective of their own independent expertise.
Does GDP take into cognizance things like poverty numbers, unemployment rate, for example? Because those are issues that touch on the heart of what citizens are concerned.
Yeah, all those things will be reflected definitely. But of course, again, if your GDP is growing, then the potentials for you to mitigate unemployment is also it will be there. And again, if it is growing, you also know that it cannot be growing in a vacuum. It means that increased activities is not done. It's not a result of non-humans working. It is humans, that are triggering those activities. So it means that more people are getting engaged. So by in that way too, you can say, okay, unemployment is probably reducing if the GDP is growing, or more people are likely to get employed or to quit the unemployment bracket in no time, as the case could be.
Let's talk about the private sector because they are, to a large extent, the engine room, just like you have the SMEs, for instance. So when the GDP is rebased or re-benchmarked, what are the specific implications that action in itself have for the organized private sector?
The private sector is very critical in any economy. They provide They require stability. They are very useful for stimulating some big activity, huge activities, perhaps in the banking sector, perhaps in fintech as well, in construction, in industry, in manufacturing and production. So they are parts in the rebasing or in the recalculation of the GDP. It's always very, very important. And of course, you always continue to give kudos to them if a GDP becomes positive, because what government just does is to be an enabler, creating the required environment, making regulations, and of course, partnering with them when the need arises. But they drive it in the main. And in a country where the government is in control of the commanding heights, you will say that isn't suitable enough or good enough for free market operations. It's not an economy; it's a controlled economy, and controlling economies is becoming a thing of old now. Even the old Soviet socialist republics, are starting to liberalize. Creating initiative for citizens to be integrated into the economic matrix. So ours is the pseudo-capitalist economy. We're just trying to grow, and if you want to thrive as a capitalist economy, you need to encourage the private sector. And if your GDP has grown, of course, you always will want to think that the role of the private sector cannot be undermined in the circumstance. They will have been a part of it, and it also mean that the prospect that they will continue to collaborate with you, and help you grow the GDP further, it's actually profound.
I can imagine. Well, turns out this is where we're going to leave it for now.
Thank you.
Incidentally, the process has just, barely even started, which means we'll have a lot to track going forward. And Global Television, as always, will keep an eye out for you in terms of these developments. I've been speaking with Professor Abiodun Adeni. He's a professor of communication at Base University here in Nigeria's capital, Abuja. Prof, again, thank you for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
We'll take a break now. When we return, Jumai and I will wrap it up on today's edition of Global Morning. Global Morning is your top morning show here on Global Television.
We bring you fresh news updates daily while delving into a variety of current affairs and topics.
And at the same time, keeping you well informed about important events, both national and internationals.
Global Morning serves as a valuable source of information, helping viewers like you start your day well informed.
Stay connected from Monday through Sunday to a wide range of latest news making rounds on Global Morning.
We're on the road to protest.
And the president meets all of our demands.
This is Global Morning.